We are not going to win this war of attrition. We keep telling ourselves that everything over there will collapse. It hasn't and it won't. Meanwhile, our costs keep rising. Those words were spoken on May 21st at a closed-door meeting of economists at the Moscow Exchange. The speaker was Andrei Klepacz, for 12 years the chief economist of Russia's State Development Bank, VEB, and before that a deputy minister of economic development. In other words, a man from the heart of the Russian establishment. Excerpts from his remarks leaked to the Russian media in mid-August. A day later, Klepacz lost his job. Among the reasons he cited for Russia's mounting costs was one in particular: Ukrainian strikes on energy and logistics infrastructure. And indeed, as the dynamics on the front increasingly resemble those of the Great War, the strategic center of gravity is steadily shifting away from the trenches, into the air and toward the long-range strike campaign. Ukraine continues its attacks, steadily degrading Russia's fuel and energy sector. Over the past 2 months, it has also added a new target set: the warehouses of wildberries, Russia's answer to Amazon. Russia, meanwhile, is strengthening its defenses, especially the protective ring around Moscow, while retaliating with even greater force against Ukraine, particularly with ballistic missiles, against which Kyiv is increasingly struggling to defend itself. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has now passed the 1,600-day mark. The war has therefore lasted longer than the entirety of World War I. And yet there is still no end in sight. What is changing, however, is the way both sides are trying to win it. So where is this war heading now? Over 1,600 days in, longer than the entire First World War, and no end in sight. And wars on this scale don't remain confined to the battlefield. Their economic consequences inevitably ripple through global markets, which is exactly why I use XTB, the partner of this channel and the place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 11,700 instruments from around the world, along with the latest market news and expert analysis, all in one convenient app. XTB platform also offers real stocks and ETFs with 0% commission, up to equivalent to €100,000 monthly turnover. Above 0.2% commission applies. XTB also offers retirement accounts in selected markets that may provide tax advantages. The financial instruments offered involve risk. Invest responsibly. It has been more than 2 months since our last review of the long-range strike campaign. Since then, the campaign has not only maintained its intensity, but increased it and expanded its reach. Our map now shows around 40 major strikes on refineries, terminals, pumping stations, and other parts of Russia's energy infrastructure. And even that is not the full picture, because there also have been nearly 30 additional attacks on civilian logistics facilities and wildberries warehouses. Let's go through them in order. Starting in mid-June, we should first recall the strike on port infrastructure in Novorossiysk and 2 attacks on the Moscow refinery in Kapotnia, a facility with capacity of around 240,000 barrels per day that supplies the Moscow metropolitan area. According to S&P Global, the refinery was forced offline after the strikes, and fuel shortages began to be felt even in the capital. July, meanwhile, brought a barrage. Ufa, Saratov, Norsy, Inkstovo, Ilski, Syzrań, Salavat, Apficki, Nowokuybishevsk, Yaroslav, Ryazan, Perm, Volgograd. Then there were the ports of Vysotsk and Ustluga, along with pumping stations and gas infrastructure. On July 6, drones reached all the way to Omsk, striking the largest refinery in Russia, capable of processing more than 400,000 barrels per day. Not long afterward, Reuters reported queues at local filling stations. There is an obvious recurring pattern. Most of these names are appearing for the second, third, or fourth time. Saratov was hit on July 1st, again on August 2nd, and once more on August 10th. Ryazan was struck in late July and then again 3 days later. The same pattern keeps repeating. The cumulative effect is significant. In late July, the Financial Times reported that as much as 45% of Russia's refining capacity had been taken offline, describing the situation as the most serious fuel crisis this oil-based economy had faced since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with sales restrictions in nearly every region and long queues at filling stations. The paper also noted that the Ukrainian operation was being supported by US and French intelligence. Further strikes in August only increased the pressure. Taneco in Tatarstan was hit, as was petrochemical infrastructure in Tobolsk, and on August 11th, drones reached Orsk. The refinery was shut down completely, while the regional governor acknowledged that repairs to key infrastructure could take as long as 6 months, because the necessary equipment is imported and difficult to replace under sanctions. Afterward, only around 80% of filling stations in the region remained operational. On August 13th, Ukraine also struck Unecha on the Druzhba pipeline, followed in the next few days by renewed attacks on Volgograd and Syzran. The pressure then is no longer focused on refining alone. It covers the entire system: processing, storage, transmission, and exports. The effects are visible beyond the burning facilities themselves. In July, Russia's seaborne exports of petroleum products fell by 1/3 compared with June and by more than half year-on-year. In August, fuel shortages returned in at least 10 regions, while Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, began importing gasoline from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and even India. A shipment of around 68,000 tons of gasoline from an Indian refinery arrived at the port of Vitino. None of this means, of course, that Ukraine has, quote, cut Russia off from oil. Paradoxically, when refineries are shut down, Moscow can simply export part of the crude instead. In June, Russia's seaborne crude exports actually increased, while exports of refined products fell sharply. So the campaign is hitting Russia's domestic fuel market, refining margins, and logistics first, but not necessarily the federal budget immediately. But from mid-July onward, a completely new category also appeared on Ukraine's target map: Wildberries warehouses. Russia's answer to Amazon and the country's largest e-commerce platform first became a target of Ukrainian strikes on July 18th. The opening salvo hit 2 huge logistics centers in Kotovsk and Elektrostal. 7 employees were killed in the first strike and dozens were wounded. Ukraine says the hubs are used, among other things, to distribute drone components, electronics and equipment for Russian troops. Wildberries and the Kremlin deny this. But the July 18th attack proved to be only the beginning. 4 days later, warehouses were burning in Krasnodar and Nievinnomysk. Then came St. Petersburg, Leningrad Oblast and Simferopol. By the end of the month, Ryazan, Penza, Sarapul and Volgograd. In August, strikes followed in the Samara, Vladimir, Tver, Tula, Voronezh and Bashkortostan regions, as well as Yekaterinburg. On August 16th, a massive fire broke out in Koledino outside Moscow. According to the independent Russian outlet Agentstvo, cited by the Financial Times, this was already the 7th of Wildberries' 10 largest hubs to be hit this summer. By August 7th, Reuters had identified at least 20 facilities that had been attacked. Satellite image analysis suggested that at least 1.2 million square meters of warehouse space had been damaged or destroyed, more than 1/5 of the entire network's storage capacity. Later, Russian estimates put that figure as high as nearly 30%. Why does this matter? In 2025, Wildberries handled goods worth roughly $75 billion, equivalent to around 3% of Russia's GDP. Behind the platform are hundreds of thousands of sellers, pickup points, and entire local businesses. Reuters described entrepreneurs who lost nearly half of the entire inventory in a single fire. The company's insurance does not cover attacks classified as terrorism or sabotage, meaning the cost spreads outward to merchants, banks, and eventually the state. Moreover, from August 22nd onward, Ukrainian drones also began targeting logistics hubs belonging to Ozon, Russia's second-largest online retailer. In just 3 days, 6 of its hubs were targeted, while the company's shares briefly plunged by nearly 30%. The Kremlin's response to these developments is even more interesting. On August 24th, Putin signed a decree allowing the state to temporarily take control of strategic companies deemed unable to adequately protect themselves against Ukrainian attacks. So this is another version of the same strategy used against their refineries. Ukraine does not need to destroy the Russian economy in a single blow. It only needs to make more and more parts of it work worse, cost more, and operate under constant pressure. But Russia's shield is learning and hitting back. For balance, one thing should be made clear. Not every one of these strikes ends with a spectacular refinery fire. As Ukraine's capabilities grow, Russia is adapting its defenses as well. A good example is the massive attack on August 18th. Ukraine launched nearly 800 drones toward Russia, most of them aimed at Moscow and the surrounding region. This time, however, the results were meager. There was some localized damage, but compared with the scale of the attack, the outcome was poor. Russia has built a layered defensive zone around the capital, and Kyiv itself acknowledges that the Kremlin is moving more and more air defense assets there. On June 18th, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed to have shot down 555 Ukrainian drones, although some still penetrated Moscow's defenses and badly damaged the refinery in Kapotnia. 2 months later, despite an even larger salvo, the results were far more limited. A growing number of commentators see this as a mistake by the Ukrainian command. French analyst Clément Mollin, who is broadly sympathetic to Ukraine, argues that Kyiv is wasting hundreds of drones on a region defended by at least 200 air defense systems and hundreds of additional mobile fire teams. He estimates that while roughly 10 to 20% of Russian drones managed to penetrate Ukrainian defenses, only around 2 to 5% of Ukrainian drones aimed at the Moscow region actually reached their targets. So Russia's defense against Ukraine's long-range striking arm is improving locally, especially around Moscow. Russia studies trajectories, reinforces the most threatened approaches, and is capable of neutralizing a huge share of incoming drones. The more often Ukraine returns to the same high-profile targets, such as Moscow, the harder they become to hit. And Russia is certainly not standing idle. If we look not at individual spectacular strikes, but at the overall scale of the air war, Ukraine is still under far heavier bombardment. Between June 30th and July 7th alone, Russia launched 1,437 drones and 155 missiles, more than 200 aerial attack weapons per day. And this was hardly an exceptional week. Salvos involving hundreds of Shaheds, Gerberas, and other drones have been the Russian norm. Their purpose is not only to cause damage, but also to systematically overload Ukraine's air defenses. The even bigger problem, however, is ballistic missiles. Ukraine is getting better at dealing with drones, using mobile fire teams, machine guns, light air defense systems, and more recently its own interceptor drones. But against an Iskander, traveling at several kilometers per second, Ukraine simply has no domestic solution. That leaves the Patriot system, and Kyiv has desperately few launchers, and above all PAC-3 interceptors. Zelensky said on August 5th that this year the Allies had supplied only 1/3 of what they delivered in 2025. The Russians know this perfectly well. In July they launched 195 ballistic missiles, of which, according to Ukrainian data cited by Reuters, only 29 were intercepted. More than 80% penetrated the defenses. On August 8th, 6 missiles were launched and not a single one was shot down. The problem is structural. Russian production of Iskanders and Kinjals is estimated at around 700 to 800 per year, while total Western production of interceptors does not even keep pace with that, let alone the willingness to divert them to Kyiv, especially in the context of the war with Iran. As a result, the Russian strike campaign is also changing in character. Drones still provide the mass, but increasingly they are only the first layer, forcing Ukraine to activate radars and engage short-range air defenses before Iskanders and Kinjals arrive behind them, aimed at the most important targets. And those targets are not chosen at random. Russia is increasingly focusing on the defense industry, energy infrastructure, logistics and ports. In Kyiv, facilities linked to the production of drones, missiles and electronics are being hit regularly. In July, Russia waged an almost continuous campaign against Odessa, Chornomorsk and other Black Sea ports, trying to raise the cost and risk of Ukrainian exports. According to regional authorities, the ports were attacked daily with 50 to 60 drones and missiles. On July 19th, the bulk carrier Golden Leo was hit, killing 10 of its 17 crew members. We will return to the economic consequences of this campaign later. At the same time, Russia has resumed strikes on Naftogaz facilities, clearly laying the groundwork for another winter campaign against Ukraine's energy system. The company says its facilities have already been attacked around 300 times in 2026. Then there are major industrial targets. The ArcelorMittal steelworks in Kryvyi Rih, the largest in the country, was seriously damaged in an August 16 strike. Russia is also responding to attacks on Wildberries by striking facilities belonging to Nowa Poczta, Ukrpoczta and ATB. The impact of this pressure is also visible in civilian casualty figures. July 2026 was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since May 2022. The UN confirmed 437 people killed and more than 2,600 wounded, with long-range weapons, missiles and drones responsible for a significant share of those casualties. That was an increase of more than 70% compared with July last year. And on top of that comes the relentless use of the so-called CABs, guided glide bombs dropped on cities near the front. OSW notes that in Zaporozhye, air raid alerts are in force for roughly 90% of the time, and in some parts of the region, virtually without interruption. In mid-August, Zelensky said Russia was launching around 220 glide bombs per day. In this exchange, however, Ukraine is responding not only with strikes deep inside Russia proper, but for some time now, it has also been systematically plunging Crimea into darkness. Quite literally. First, Ukraine began targeting fuel supplies, refineries in southern Russia, tanker trucks, depots, roads and crossings leading to Crimea. By late May, gasoline rationing had already been introduced on the peninsula, and by June, the situation had become so difficult that Sevastopol temporarily suspended fuel sales to private drivers. A liter of 95-octane gasoline now costs around 250 rubles, 3 to 4 times more than before the campaign. While filling stations, as one taxi driver told AFP, have stopped displaying prices, quote, so as not to upset people. On June 26, the Russian occupation authorities declared a state of emergency in Crimea and Sevastopol. Officially, the move was intended to make it easier to pay compensation, invoke force majeure clauses, and support businesses affected by supply disruptions. Then came the electricity. By July 15th, Medusa had geolocated strikes on at least 42 substations across Crimea, ranging from small local installations to major 330 kilovolt nodes. Ukraine also said it had struck the receiving point for electricity supplied through the Kuban-Crimea energy bridge. The campaign culminated on the night of July 13th to 14th, when an underground resistance network, working with Ukrainian deep strike units, attacked the Balaklava power plant near Sevastopol. The strike damaged the Siemens turbine hall and cooling systems. Ukrainian assessments suggested that if the pumps were also destroyed, Repairs could take between 2 and 5 months. Depending on the source, Balaklava alone accounts for between 1/3 and 1/2 of the peninsula's energy generation, while together with the Tavria power plant near Simferopol, it provides around 90% of Crimea's domestically generated power. The effect is visible even from space. An analysis of satellite imagery by Medusa found that on July 3rd, nighttime illumination across the peninsula was 83% lower than in April. The Bell, using data from the Russian electricity market, calculated that during the first 20 days of July, electricity consumption in Crimea fell 42% year-on-year. Plant electricity generation in Crimea, excluding Sevastopol, collapsed by 83% over the same period. The pressure is also affecting transport. The number of trains running between Russia and the peninsula has been cut in half, while those that remain now terminate at the station near the Crimean Bridge, with passengers continuing by bus. The bridge itself remains open, but repeated alerts and closures create enormous traffic jams. On June 26, after an overnight suspension of traffic, around 2,800 cars were waiting to cross, with delays of up to 5 hours for those trying to leave Crimea. In the opposite direction, almost no one was traveling that day. The land route from Rostov is hardly safe either. Ukrainian forces systematically target fuel tankers and transport vehicles there, earning the road the nickname the Road of Death among drivers. The most ambitious part of the operation, however, is at sea. Since early July, Ukrainian drones have systematically targeted tankers and other vessels carrying fuel across the Sea of Azov. Reuters confirmed that around a dozen such ships were attacked on July 6 and 7th alone. Robert Madziar-Brovdi, commander of Ukraine's unmanned system forces, said that by August 8th, Operation Molochka had struck 218 vessels, 134 in the Sea of Azov and 84 in the Black Sea. The operation's name is itself an acronym for the phrase "Moscow will fall through Crimea." That tally cannot be independently verified, but all-seen data points to a real effect. The Oko Gora project recorded a drop in the number of detected ships in the Sea of Azov from 134 in early July to just 14 in early August, a 90% decline in a single month. Every route Russia tries to use as a substitute eventually becomes a target itself. Mikhailo Fedorov, while still serving as defense minister, spoke of, quote, turning Crimea into an island, while Brovdi has described the current campaign as only the first phase of a broader operation aimed at pushing Russian forces off the peninsula. August proved that this is more than just rhetoric. On August 13th, a strike plunged Sevastopol into darkness after hitting the area around the Balaklava power plant. The oil terminal in Feodosia is out of operation. The Chonkhar bridge has been damaged. Fuel tankers were hit near Armiansk, and filling stations in Sevastopol simply ran dry. This is still not a blockade of the peninsula, but just as with the refinery campaign, the objective is degradation rather than complete isolation. But the same logic also works in the opposite direction. As we mentioned earlier, Russia has intensified attacks on Odessa, Chornomorsk, and commercial shipping. By late July, shipowners had temporarily stopped sending vessels to Ukrainian ports, and under normal conditions, around 90% of Ukraine's agricultural exports move through the Black Sea. The situation reached the point where on August 13th, one day after the strike on Novorossiysk forced Russia to suspend operations at all 3 terminals, it was Ukraine that proposed a mutual halt to attacks on civilian ships and port infrastructure in the Black Sea. The reason is simple. In August, grain exports were as much as 76% lower than a year earlier, while alternative routes, rail and the Danube ports, simply do not have enough capacity, according to Kyiv, to replace Odessa. And what about the economy? After all, that is what Ukraine's strike campaign is ultimately trying to break. In short, Russia is still nowhere near economic collapse, but it continues to slide toward stagflation and toward a repeat of the Smuta, a prolonged period of stagnation and disorder. The clearest evidence comes from the Bank of Russia itself. In July, it cut its forecast for 2026 GDP growth to just 0 to 1%. At the same time, it expects inflation of 6 to 7%, while the key interest rate, despite earlier cuts, still stands at 14%, a level that arguably reflects the country's true inflationary pressure more accurately. In other words, Russia now has stagnation combined with extremely expensive money and a massive wartime fiscal stimulus. Pressure on the budget is also mounting. After the first 7 months of the year, the federal deficit reached around 6.5 trillion rubles, or 2.8% of GDP, almost twice the amount originally planned for the entire year. And that is especially telling because the first half of the year was relatively kind to the Kremlin. The war in the Persian Gulf drove oil prices higher, and between March and June brought Russia an additional 1.2 trillion rubles, roughly 0.5% of GDP. Even with that windfall, hydrocarbon revenues for the first half of the year were still lower than a year earlier. So is it fair to say that Russia is, quote, running out of money? No, that would go too far. Moscow still earns enormous revenues from exports, can raise taxes, and can borrow in its own currency. Higher oil prices have helped cover part of the deficit and may give the Kremlin more time before the economy begins forcing difficult choices over the war. At the same time, however, the easily accessible fiscal cushion is now far smaller than it was at the start of the invasion. As of June 1st, the liquid portion of the National Wealth Fund stood at 3.4 trillion rubles, around 1.5% of GDP. Before the invasion, those assets were worth more than 4 times as much. And the concern is no longer confined to Western analysis. On August 16th, the independent Russian outlet The Bell, later cited by the Financial Times, reported the dismissal of Andrei Klepach, who had spent 12 years as chief economist at the State Development Bank, VEB, and previously served as Deputy Minister of Economic Development. The reason? A May 21st speech at the Nikitsky Club near the Moscow Exchange, excerpts of which surfaced only in mid-August. Klepach said bluntly, quote, "We are not going to win this war of attrition. We keep telling ourselves that everything over there will collapse. It hasn't, and it won't. Meanwhile, our costs keep rising." Unquote. Russia is losing, he added, not only to China and the United States, but in a sense also to Ukraine. And although the economy itself will not collapse, a social crisis is almost inevitable. Most importantly, he explicitly identified Ukrainian attacks on energy and logistics infrastructure as one source of the additional pressure. He was dismissed the day after those remarks spread through Russian media. According to The Bell's sources, VEB chief Igor Shuvalov made the decision after receiving a call, quote, "from above." The examples keep multiplying, and transport offers a good illustration. Reuters found that fuel prices have recently risen by around 16 to 18%, while road freight rates increased by 12 to 15% in July, and by as much as 50% on some routes. Nabiullina herself acknowledged that higher fuel costs were beginning to feed into the prices of a wide range of goods and services, making it harder to cut interest rates more quickly. That is how the economic dimension of this war should be understood. There is little reason to expect a spectacular crash. Instead, the burdens keep accumulating: a larger deficit, more expensive credit, a smaller fiscal cushion, higher transport cost, and an ever-growing share of labor and capital diverted toward the war. And Ukraine? Economically, it is in an even weaker position. The IMF expects growth of only 1 to 1.6% this year, debt of around 112% of GDP, and a deficit, excluding grants, exceeding 1/5 of the economy. The difference is that Ukraine is financially sustained by the West. Russia has to remain more or less self-sufficient. and with every additional year of war, that becomes harder, while ordinary citizens ultimately foot the bill. The final piece of this puzzle remains the front. On the one hand, it is absolutely crucial. On the other, it is becoming increasingly static. According to ISW, Russian forces advanced by just 38 square kilometers in all of July, an area smaller than Manhattan, averaging 1.2 square kilometers per day. If we include territory they merely infiltrated without actually controlling, the figure raises to 121 square kilometers. For comparison, in July 2025, they captured 456 square kilometers. The spring-summer offensive launched in March has so far produced no operational breakthrough. While Deep State estimates that at the current pace, Russia has no realistic chance of capturing the entire Donetsk region in either 2026 or even 2027. Kyiv, meanwhile, is highlighting its own offensive operations. On August 12, Volodymyr Zelensky said that an operation conducted since the start of the year around the junction of the Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk and Zaporozhye regions had recaptured a total of 745 square kilometers and 26 settlements. Based on geolocated footage, ISW puts the recovered area at around 627 square kilometers. The exact balance, however, is impossible to verify conclusively. The figure combines several months of fighting, a larger offensive in February and March, and a more limited push from May through July, while the line of control remains unclear across parts of the area. Deep State assessed that Ukraine had recaptured 18 settlements and pushed Russian forces out of 6 more. None of that changes the fact that Ukraine has achieved real successes, especially during the second phase of operations, from May to July. Ukrainian forces did push the Russians back along parts of the Oleksandrivka axis and improved their tactical position. What explains those gains? In February, Ukraine benefited significantly from Russia suddenly losing unauthorized access to Starlink, which temporarily disrupted communications, command and control, and drone operations. Ukrainian forces also exploited the dispersed nature of Russian positions and gaps created by earlier infiltration tactics. But Russia gradually adapted, and the first Ukrainian offensive ran out of momentum in March without achieving all of its objectives. Later, operations became more limited and methodical. Today, ISW points primarily to Ukraine's drone advantage, local counterattacks, and systematic strikes on Russian rear areas and logistics as the main factors slowing the Russian advance. That does not mean Russia has stopped attacking. The most dangerous sector for Ukraine now stretches across a broad arc from Dobropilya through Druszkivka to Konstantinivka. Rather than seeking one dramatic breakthrough, Russian forces are trying to gradually outflank Ukraine's belt of fortress cities from the south and west, cut its logistics, and create the conditions for further pressure on Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. ISW identifies the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya axis as a Russian priority precisely because they offer a route around that defensive belt from the southwest. Konstantinivka remains one of the key elements of this entire defensive system. Here too, the fighting looks very different from a conventional assault on a city. For months, Russian troops have been infiltrating in small groups, occupying individual buildings and basements, trying to consolidate one position after another, while attacking Ukrainian logistics with drones and glide bombs. Some Russian groups had already held positions inside the city, but Russia still does not fully control Konstantinivka, despite officially declaring its capture as early as July 3rd. In August, Ukrainian forces were still counterattacking and eliminating Russian infiltrators both inside the city and on its northern approaches. As a result, Russia still holds the initiative across much of the front and continues to attack, but it is finding it increasingly difficult to turn that advantage into a durable breakthrough. The exact territorial balance for 2026 depends on methodology. ISW puts Russia at minus 234 square kilometers, while other estimates suggest something closer to parity or a small net gain for the Kremlin. Much depends on whether areas penetrated by small Russian groups are counted as captured, infiltrated, or simply part of the grey zone. Whatever the methodology, however, the scale of Russia's advances remains limited compared with the previous year. ISW assesses that the current spring-summer offensive has so far produced no operationally significant success. Ukraine, for its part, is unable to launch a major counteroffensive on the scale of 2022. It can recapture territory locally and exploit weaknesses in Russian positions. But as disputes over flag-raising operations on the Oleksandrivka axis have shown, its own successes also require a careful distinction between lasting control, raids, and the grey zone. The most telling figure, however, is the cost of Russia's advance. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russia suffered around 43,000 personnel casualties in July. ISW compared that figure with territorial gains it had independently confirmed and arrived at a staggering 1,132 Russian casualties for every square kilometer actually captured. That calculation is based on Ukrainian casualty estimates, so it should be treated with caution, but even ISW itself described that figure as staggering. So the front is not completely frozen. Russian forces are still searching for new weak points, infiltrating Ukrainian positions and preparing further local operations. But after 4.5 years of war, the word offensive increasingly means thousands of men and tens of thousands of drones expanded simply to move the line on the map by a few kilometers. The front has slowed, but the war itself has not. Much like in the First World War, the conflict is now less and less about achieving one decisive breakthrough, and more about states' ability to absorb losses over time, sustain production and logistics, and keep financing the war effort. After more than 1,600 days, the central question is therefore becoming less who moves the front first, and more which system breaks first under the pressure of a war of attrition.